The drone operator's screen flickered once, then locked onto the target. 30 armored vehicles, T-72s and BMP-3s, were moving across open ground northwest of Avdiivka, churning frozen soil into black furrows as they advanced in a column nearly 2 kilometers long. The timestamp on the Mavic 3 thermal feed read 06.14. Dawn hadn't fully broken. The Ukrainian forward observer, watching from a concealed position on the slag heap ridge, keyed his radio and said 4 words. "They're all coming through." What happened in the next 40 minutes would be replayed in OSINT channels, analyzed by defense institutes, and cited in after-action reviews from Kyiv to Washington. 30 Russian tanks and armored vehicles pushed toward a fortified Ukrainian line in a single-massed assault. By the time the smoke settled, the kill zone northwest of Avdiivka had swallowed the better part of a battalion tactical group's armor. Not because Ukrainian defenders were lucky, because the ground had been prepared to receive exactly this kind of attack. Over the next 34 minutes, we're going to reconstruct that assault frame by frame, using released drone footage, geolocated wreckage coordinates, and open-source battle damage assessments. We're going to show you how a column of 30 vehicles funneled into a layered kill zone, why Russian doctrine kept sending armor forward without adequate infantry screening, and what this single engagement reveals about the attrition mathematics that defined the Avdiivka campaign. The question isn't just how Ukraine stopped this assault. It's why Russia kept repeating the same approach, expecting different results, at a cost measured in irreplaceable armor that no factory in Nizhny Tagil could replace fast enough. How did this happen? And why did Russian planners have no answer when it did? To understand what unfolded northwest of Avdiivka in late 2023, you have to understand what Avdiivka meant to both sides by that point in the war. The city sat on elevated ground. The Donetsk slag heaps provided natural observation posts with line of sight across the flat approaches to the north and west. Russian forces had been trying to encircle Avdiivka since the earliest days of the full-scale invasion, but by autumn 2023, the effort had intensified sharply. The 90th Guards Tank Army and elements of the 1st Guards Tank Army were cycling units through the Avdiivka axis, committing significant armored strength to what Russian planners clearly viewed as a prestige objective. Taking Avdiivka would sever a Ukrainian logistics node, compress the front, and provide a propaganda victory at a moment when Russian offensives elsewhere had stalled or collapsed. Ukrainian defenses around Avdiivka had been built over years, not months, years. The 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade, reinforced by elements of the 53rd Separate Mechanized Brigade and drone units operating under the broader Aerorozvidka framework, had layered the approaches methodically. Minefields extended several kilometers beyond the forward line of troops. Anti-tank ditches channeled any armored advance into predictable corridors. Those corridors were pre-registered by artillery and covered by FPV drone teams positioned in the slag heap network. When Russian commanders looked at their maps and identified what appeared to be a viable avenue of approach northwest of the city, relatively flat terrain, fewer visible obstacles, they were looking at exactly what Ukrainian engineers wanted them to see. The Ukrainian defensive scheme around Avdiivka in late 2023 was, in the assessment of multiple Western defense analysts citing Ukrainian General Staff briefings, one of the most thoroughly prepared anti-armor defensive positions of the entire war. ISW reporting from October through December 2023 consistently noted that Russian armored assaults on the Avdiivka axis were producing exchange ratios deeply unfavorable to the attackers. What the released drone footage from this specific engagement would confirm, for anyone willing to look frame by frame, was precisely why. Russia's intelligence picture going into this assault was, based on the behavior captured in those drone feeds, almost certainly incomplete. What's most striking isn't the scale of the armored commitment. It's the absence of any apparent reconnaissance in force before the main push. When you watch the footage from the Mavic 3 thermal camera and the subsequent FPV drone feeds, you see vehicles advancing in column formation along a route that had been surveilled by Ukrainian drone operators for days. Intercepted forward observer reports suggested the Russian battalion tactical group staging for this assault had conducted minimal route clearance and had not dedicated engineering assets to mine breach operations on the northwestern approach corridor. Ukrainian intelligence analysts working with imagery from commercial satellite providers, Maxar and Planet Labs imagery was being processed by volunteer OSINT networks within hours of collection, had tracked the assembly of this armored grouping in staging areas roughly 12 kilometers behind the forward line. The concentration was visible. Vehicle thermal signatures clustered in tree lines, fuel and ammunition vehicles nearby, the characteristic pattern of a unit preparing to move rather than holding position. The Ukrainian forward observer on the slag heap ridge had visual confirmation by the time the column began to move. The kill zone had been waiting. The column was coming to it. Here's what didn't make sense on the surface, and what took analysts several weeks of post-engagement examination to fully reconstruct. The route the Russian column chose had been assessed by Ukrainian engineers as the most mine-dense approach corridor on the entire northwestern axis. It wasn't a gap in Ukrainian defenses. It was the deepest layer of them. The terrain features that made it look passable from aerial imagery, slightly firmer ground, fewer visible obstacles, were precisely what Ukrainian mine-laying teams had exploited to conceal anti-tank mines beneath a surface that read clean on standard optical reconnaissance. Russia had the option of sending engineering vehicles and mine-clearing equipment ahead of the armor. According to satellite imagery analysis published by the Conflict Intelligence Team and cross-referenced with Ukrainian General Staff reporting, no such assets were observed moving with the lead elements of this assault. The BTG's configuration, as reconstructed from the drone footage, showed tanks at the front, infantry fighting vehicles behind, with no dedicated mine-clearing systems in the lead, no IMR-2 combat engineering vehicles, no mine rollers on the lead tanks. This wasn't an isolated oversight. It was a pattern that OSINT analysts had documented across multiple Russian armored assaults on the Avdiivka axis throughout autumn 2023. Russia's battalion tactical groups were committing armor to frontal assaults against prepared positions without the engineering support their own doctrine theoretically required. The question of why that gap persisted is one we'll return to. And here is where this gets interesting. Because what the drone footage captured beginning at approximately 06:14 that morning wasn't a clean, sequential engagement. It was a cascade, a series of events that once begun, the attacking force had no way to stop because it had no means to stop it. The first vehicles to enter the mine belt were lead tanks, T-72B3s, based on the turret geometry visible in the thermal footage. The first mine detonation occurred roughly 800 meters inside what Ukrainian defensive maps designated as the primary anti-tank minefield sector. The explosion immobilized the lead tank. Not a catastrophic kill, not a full detonation of the ammunition load, but a track blow that left the vehicle stationary and blocking the route. In column formation, with vehicles spaced at the interval captured on the drone feed, this was immediately consequential. The vehicles behind had seconds to respond. Some slowed. Some attempted to maneuver around the stricken tank. Maneuvering off the established route took them deeper into the minefield. Put yourself in the position of the commander in the second tank. Your lead vehicle has just been immobilized by a mine detonation. You can't see what's ahead of it. Your radio is filled with reports you can't fully process. You have roughly 4 seconds to decide whether to halt, push left, or push right. The terrain to the left looks marginally clearer. You turn left. The second mine detonation came 17 seconds after the first, based on the timestamps on the released footage. The third came 41 seconds after the second. By this point, the column had compressed, rear vehicles closing on forward vehicles that had stopped or slowed. and was beginning to present the kind of dense, stationary target that Ukrainian FPV drone operators had trained for hundreds of hours to engage. The FPV teams operating in the Avdiivka sector during this period were part of a drone warfare infrastructure that Ukrainian forces had built over nearly 2 years of full-scale war. These weren't improvised units anymore. By late 2023, Ukrainian FPV drone operators worked in coordinated cells, typically 3 to 5 operators with a logistics element handling munitions and replacement vehicles, with dedicated communication channels to artillery fire direction centers. When the mine detonations signaled that the Russian column had entered the kill zone, the FPV cells received tasking within minutes. The drones used in this engagement were modified racing quadcopters carrying shaped charge warheads, typically repurposed RPG warheads or purpose-built anti-armor munitions, range from operator to target, roughly 3 to 5 kilometers depending on terrain and signal conditions. Flight time from launch positions in the slag heap network to target, under 90 seconds. Each operator could typically manage 1 to 3 engagements before returning to a resupply point. The footage released from this engagement shows at least 7 distinct FPV impact events on vehicles that had been immobilized or slowed by the mine detonations. Vehicles that were stationary or near stationary, presenting maximum target surface to incoming drones.
It can test a route.
Here's a thought to sit with. How many FPV drones, each costing roughly $400 to $800 to produce and deploy, does it take to halt an armored column worth tens of millions of dollars? The footage from Avdiivka suggests the answer is fewer than most people assume. That cost-exchange ratio is at the center of everything that followed on this axis. The artillery piece of this engagement operated in parallel with the FPV strikes, not sequentially. This is a detail the released footage makes clear, and that matters doctrinally. Ukrainian indirect fire support, 155mm howitzers from NATO-supplied systems, supplemented by Soviet-caliber artillery, had pre-registered firing solutions on the approach corridor. When the column entered the kill zone, fire missions were already queued. The combination of pre-registered artillery on stationary targets and FPV drones engaging individual vehicles produced what Ukrainian commanders, in subsequent after-action reporting cited by ISW, described as a near-simultaneous fires effect across the entire depth of the engaged column. Russian forces in the column had no meaningful counter to this. Electronic warfare systems, which Russian forces had deployed extensively on the Avdiivka axis, could disrupt some FPV drone control signals. This was an ongoing technical competition that Ukrainian drone units were constantly adapting to. But electronic warfare could not lift mines that had already been laid. It could not suppress pre-registered artillery firing on known coordinates, and it could not reconstitute the command structure of a column whose lead vehicles had been immobilized and whose follow-on units were now trying to maneuver in a minefield under fire. The engagement lasted roughly 40 minutes from the first mine detonation to the point at which surviving vehicles began attempting to withdraw. The drone footage, as analyzed by the conflict intelligence team and cross-referenced with Ukrainian General Staff reporting, documented the burning or immobilized hulks of at least 19 vehicles within the kill zone. Subsequent commercially available Maxar imagery geolocated to the engagement area confirmed wreckage consistent with the drone footage across a corridor roughly 1 kilometer wide and 2 kilometers deep. The wreckage distribution itself told the story of the column's attempt to maneuver. Vehicles clustered at the mine detonation points, then scattered attempts to find clear ground, then the secondary impact points where FPV drones and artillery caught the maneuver attempts. If you've been following this war with any depth, you've probably seen similar footage before. Russian armor burning on open ground, drone feeds tracking vehicles as they slow, stop, and receive multiple impacts. And here's a take that will probably generate some pushback. The recurring nature of these engagements isn't evidence that Russian commanders were simply incompetent. It's evidence of a structural problem that competent individual commanders couldn't solve at the battalion level. The Russian military's battalion tactical group concept, developed over decades and refined against adversaries who lacked the layered anti-armor capability Ukraine had built, was being committed to a fight for which it was not configured. Individual Russian tank commanders and infantry officers had no mechanism to refuse a tasking from higher headquarters, no institutional channel through which to report that an approach route was unsuitable without the engineering support to clear it. The decision to attack was made at a level that was not personally going to drive a T-72 through a minefield. The price of that decision was paid by the crews who were. Going through the open-source battle damage assessments from the full Avdiivka axis across the October to December 2023 period, one pattern kept coming back. The engagements that produced the highest Russian armored losses were not the ones where Ukrainian forces had the most sophisticated weapons. They were the ones where Russian forces committed armor to pre-prepared terrain without the engineering support to challenge that preparation. The T-72B3 is not an incapable platform. It's a legitimate main battle tank with composite armor, explosive reactive armor packages, and a 125mm smoothbore gun that can engage targets at 2,000 meters. It is not, however, a mine-clearing vehicle. When you send it into a minefield without mine-clearing support, you have turned a weapon system into an obstacle. By mid-morning on the day of the engagement, Ukrainian drone operators had confirmed hits on at least 19 vehicles. Russian military blogger accounts, Telegram channels like Rybar and Wargonzo, which were tracking the Avdiivka axis intensively during this period, acknowledged significant losses in the sector without providing specific numbers, using language consistent with a serious setback rather than a tactical reverse. Russian official reporting said nothing at all. The silence from official Russian sources about specific engagements of this kind was itself informative. Russian Ministry of Defense daily briefings during this period invariably reported advances measured in hundreds of meters, enemy casualties in the thousands, and Ukrainian equipment losses that bore no relationship to anything verifiable through OSINT. The gap between official Russian reporting and what drone footage, satellite imagery, and OSINT analysis showed on the ground was not new by late 2023. It had been a feature of Russian information management since the first days of the full-scale invasion. But on the Avdiivka axis specifically, the gap was particularly stark. Intercepted Russian military communications, segments of which were released by Ukrainian intelligence services during this period, showed units reporting upward that they had been stopped by mines and drone fire, requesting engineering support and counter-battery, and receiving responses that either redirected them to continue the attack or provided support that arrived too late. One intercepted exchange, authenticated by the Security Service of Ukraine and reported by Ukrainian media, captured a Russian officer describing the approach route as completely mined and requesting permission to halt and await engineering clearance. The response from the next level up instructed him to find an alternate route and continue the mission. There is no evidence in the released footage or subsequent OSINT analysis that an alternate route was found. This is the moment where most accounts focus on Ukrainian success and leave it there. But there's a detail that stuck with the analysts who tracked the Avdiivka axis through the end of the campaign, one that complicates the clean narrative of Ukrainian preparation meeting Russian negligence. The Russian assault on this morning was not the first of its kind on this axis. It was not the second. The specific approach corridor northwest of Avdiivka had seen armored assaults of varying scale on at least 4 previous occasions in the preceding 6 weeks, based on Ukrainian General Staff reporting and the pattern of wreckage visible in cumulative satellite imagery. Each previous assault had produced similar outcomes. Each previous outcome had been reported upward through Russian command channels. And yet the approach, in its basic configuration, armor forward, limited engineering support, no meaningful infantry screening ahead of the tanks, remained essentially unchanged. The question this raises about Russian command culture and operational planning is genuinely uncomfortable for anyone who wants a simple story of tactical stupidity versus tactical genius. What was being optimized for in Russian planning on this axis, if not success measured by objective achieved? The answer, which ISW analysts and other Western defense research centers have examined extensively, points toward a combination of factors: command pressure to show offensive action regardless of conditions, personnel and equipment accounting systems that rewarded reporting of attack attempts over reporting of attack outcomes, and a structural inability to translate tactical failure at battalion level into operational learning at army level fast enough to change approach before the next tasking cycle. The Russian military's attrition mathematics during the Avdiivka campaign, as reconstructed from Oryx open-source data and Ukrainian General Staff reporting, were stark. Over the full period of intensive Russian operations against Avdiivka, from approximately August 2023 through February 2024, verified Russian armored vehicle losses on the Axis, confirmed by photographic evidence and geolocated wreckage, ran into the hundreds. The specific engagement we're examining contributed at minimum 19 vehicles to that count, against a Ukrainian defensive expenditure that, while not zero, was incomparably cheaper. Mines laid weeks earlier, FPV drones manufactured for $400 to $800 each, and artillery ammunition fired against pre-planned targets with pre-calculated firing solutions. The replacement cost of a T-72B3, depending on variant and year of manufacture, runs roughly $3 to $4 million. The BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles in the column run roughly $6 to $8 million per unit. Apply conservative figures to the 19 confirmed losses from this single engagement, and the material cost to Russia exceeded $60 million. The cost to Ukraine of the defensive fires that produced those losses, mines, FPV munitions, artillery rounds, was a fraction of that figure. This is the attrition mathematics that Ukrainian commanders understood, that Western analysts cited, and that Russian operational planning appeared unable to incorporate into its decision cycle. If you're watching this because you follow the war seriously, and if you've stayed with this analysis, you clearly do. This episode matters not because it was the largest armored engagement of the Avdiivka campaign. It wasn't. It matters because it's one of the most fully documented, with drone footage, satellite imagery, and intercepted communications providing multiple independent lines of evidence that together allow a more complete reconstruction than almost any other single engagement of this scale. The pattern it reveals is not specific to this morning, this column, or this corridor. It's the pattern of the campaign. The Avdiivka campaign ended in February 2024, with Russian forces capturing the city after Ukrainian defenders decided to withdraw rather than be encircled. The withdrawal was ordered after Ukrainian command assessed that holding Avdiivka was no longer sustainable given ammunition constraints, the attrition of the defending brigades, and the threat of encirclement from multiple directions. It was not a rout. The 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade withdrew in contact, extracting personnel and whatever equipment could be moved. The city itself, by the time Russian forces occupied it, was largely destroyed. Buildings collapsed, infrastructure gone, the population that had not evacuated years earlier reduced to a handful of people in the most sheltered basements. Russia described the capture of Avdiivka as a significant victory, and in purely territorial terms, it was the most significant Russian advance in many months. What Russian information channels did not discuss, and what the cumulative OSINT evidence makes clear, was the cost at which that advance was purchased. Verified Russian armored vehicle losses on the Avdiivka axis across the full campaign ran to figures that Oryx data places in the hundreds of vehicles: tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers. The loss rate during the intensive assault phase that included the engagement we've examined was, by any historical benchmark, extraordinary. For context, the United States Army's total tank inventory, M1 Abrams of all variants, is roughly 1,500 vehicles. Russia's verified tank losses across the full Ukraine war, to the point of Avdiivka's fall, according to Oryx open-source confirmed loss data, exceeded the tank inventories of most European NATO members. The losses were not simply absorbable. Russian industry, while ramping production and drawing heavily on Soviet-era tank reserves, was producing and refurbishing tanks at a rate that could not keep pace with the loss rate on axes like Avdiivka, without drawing down the strategic reserve that Russian planners presumably needed to retain for other contingencies. The T-72 variants coming out of Russian storage and refurbishment facilities by late 2023 were increasingly the older, less capable variants, T-72A and T-72B, without the explosive reactive armor packages of the more capable T-72B3 series. OSINT analysts tracking Russian equipment at the front documented this progression. The newest and most capable vehicles were being consumed first, and the replacements coming forward were progressively less capable. This wasn't a secret. It was visible in the footage, visible in the OSINT analysis, and presumably visible to Russian commanders who were receiving these older vehicles as replacements for the newer ones their units had lost. Looking back on the full Avdiivka campaign, one question cuts through all the tactical detail. What does the campaign's cost structure reveal about Russian strategic sustainability? An army that burns through $3 to $4 million tanks to advance a defensive line by a few hundred meters, repeatedly across months of intensive operations, is on a cost curve that eventually hits a supply limit. Russian planners presumably understood this. The decision to continue anyway, to push another 30 vehicles across open ground against the same defensive preparation that had stopped the previous assault, reflects either a calculation that the strategic importance of Avdiivka justified the cost, or an inability to translate tactical cost into operational decision-making, or both. Ukrainian defenders fought effectively. The layered defensive scheme they constructed converted prepared ground into a force multiplier that amplified the effect of every weapon system they deployed. But the harder question is whether the campaign's arithmetic changed anything about how Russia fights. Will a future Russian commander, facing a similarly prepared defensive line, make a different choice? Comment, yes. If you think the lessons of Avdiivka actually changed Russian armored assault doctrine, or no, if you think the structural factors that drove this engagement are too deeply embedded to change with doctrine alone. Drone operators who flew in the Avdiivka sector during this period have described, in interviews with Ukrainian media, the psychological experience of the engagement. One operator, identified only by call sign in a Ukrainian military publication, described watching vehicles enter the mine belt and feeling, in his words, almost sorry for the crews, not for the mission they were executing, not for the command structure that sent them, but for the individual soldiers in those vehicles who had no way to know what the ground beneath them contained until it detonated. That doesn't diminish what Ukrainian defenders accomplished. It's a reminder that the cost of Russian doctrine failures was paid, first, by the Russian soldiers who were its instruments. The broader lesson of the Avdiivka armored assaults, not just this engagement but the cumulative pattern across the campaign, was absorbed by Ukrainian commanders and, through the analysis pipeline of Western defense institutes, by NATO planners watching from outside. The layered anti-armor defensive scheme that proved so effective around Avdiivka, minefields channeling approach routes, FPV drones providing precision engagement on immobilized vehicles, pre-registered artillery covering the entire engagement area, forward observers with direct communication to drone cells and artillery fire direction, was not an improvised response. It was a doctrine that Ukraine developed under combat conditions, tested against real armored assaults, and refined based on what the footage showed. The specific combination of mines, FPV drones, and indirect fire that defined the Avdiivka kill zones produced something that Western military analysts recognized as a new model for anti-armor defense. Not a replacement for tank-on-tank warfare, but a framework that allowed a defending force with fewer heavy weapons to impose catastrophic costs on an attacking force with more. Every NATO country that studied the Avdiivka footage was drawing its own conclusions about what this meant for European defense planning, for force structure requirements in a potential conflict where Russian armor might again be the primary threat, and for the procurement priorities that should follow. The publicly available assessment from U.S. defense officials, as reported by major Western outlets through 2024, held that Russia's tank force had suffered losses that would take years to fully replace even at accelerated production rates, and that the replacement vehicles coming out of Russian storage were progressively less capable than what they replaced. Russia was trading its best armor for territory, and the replacements were not equivalent. Similar tactics, massed armor against prepared defenses without adequate engineering or infantry support, have appeared at other points in modern military history, where the organizational culture of the attacking force prioritized offensive action over tactical preparation. The parallels analysts most frequently cite are not flattering to the attacker in any of those cases. Whether history is repeating itself here is not simply an academic question. It's the operational question that commanders on both sides of the Avdiivka line were grappling with every day the campaign continued. 3 questions this engagement leaves open, which the subsequent course of the war has only partially answered. Could Russia have broken through the Avdiivka defenses with adequate engineering support committed to mine-clearing operations before committing armor? The doctrinal answer is yes. Combined arms operations with genuine engineering integration have historically been able to breach even well-prepared anti-tank minefields. The operational reality in late 2023 was that Russian engineering capacity on the Avdiivka axis appeared insufficient to the task, whether from equipment shortages, personnel shortages, or simply command pressure to attack faster than engineering preparation could support. What this means for future Russian operations against similarly prepared positions remains open. How does the pattern of the Avdiivka armored assaults change the calculus for NATO defensive planning, particularly in the Baltic states and Poland, where terrain and infrastructure share some features with the Ukrainian Eastern Front? NATO planners have not published their conclusions, but the procurement patterns visible in defense budgets across Eastern Europe since 2023, extensive mine stockpiling, accelerated investment in drone capabilities, emphasis on pre-planned artillery fire coordination, suggest the lesson was not lost. And the hardest question, what is Russia's next operational axis? The place where the lessons of Avdiivka have or haven't been applied, and will Ukrainian defenders, now operating under different conditions of ammunition constraint and force structure, be able to replicate the layered defensive scheme that worked so devastatingly northwest of the city? That question doesn't have a clean answer. It has a front line. The 30 vehicles that pushed toward Avdiivka on that frozen morning did not achieve their objective. The column that was supposed to break through the Ukrainian defensive line instead became evidence, geolocated, time-stamped, and analyzed by researchers around the world, of what happens when armor is committed without the supporting elements that armor requires. 19 confirmed vehicle losses, a kill zone 2 kilometers deep, 40 minutes of engagement time, and a tactical lesson that, if the subsequent pattern of operations is any guide, was understood in Kiev rather more clearly than it was in Moscow. Every week, this channel reconstructs engagements like this one, frame by frame, coordinate by coordinate, using the open-source record that drone footage, satellite imagery, and intercepted communications create in real time. If this kind of OSINT-grounded analysis is what you come here for, subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation. The front line keeps moving, the documentation keeps accumulating, and the story of how this war is actually being fought, not the version broadcast on Russian state television, not the version that fits easily into any comfortable narrative, is there in the footage for anyone willing to look carefully enough.